Okay, in this second introductory lecture, I want to go over the values and principles of a democratic society so that we can have another sort of version of an orientation, another set of things to keep in the back of our mind as we do all of the specific explorations that we'll be doing in this class. And this is an area actually where there really is kind of a broad agreement among democratic theorists as to what the basic values and principles of a democratic society are. There are still lots of disagreements and questions, as I'll get to throughout this lecture, but basically there are 8 values that are accepted as the necessary and sufficient values of a democratic society, and they are popular sovereignty. And what popular sovereignty means really is sovereignty is the right to make rules, and popular sovereignty is that the people have the right to make rules for themselves. So in a way, popular sovereignty is kind of the catch-all for self-government. But it is important that democratic society requires that there is a popular making of rules. Representative government is another value that's accepted as part of democratic theory, even though technically there could be a democratic society that didn't have representation, that actually distributed political power and decision making to everybody instead of having certain representatives do it. But there's also an acknowledgement that that only can work at the very smallest scale, and that's really a special case of democracy, and so and it's really not going to play out all that importantly in terms of how we look at what a democratic society is going to be, because it is such a special case. So representative government, political equality. Everybody has to have equal status and equal rights. That is a key to democratic society. The notion that you could have inequality, a fundamental political inequality, goes against the consensus view of what democracy is. Now, who is included as an equal? What the criteria are for deciding where that boundary goes or where the various boundaries go, that is up for debate, and I'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll get into that also in Module 1 specifically. But political equality is a basic value. Limited government, in addition to representative government, limited government. The idea is that while the people rule themselves, that there has to be a limitation to what the government can do. Democracy is not seen as an area where all decisions for everybody's lives can be made through this system of popular sovereignty. It has a place. There is a territory, there's a sphere of popular decision making that exists, and outside that sphere is individual sovereignty. And so limited government says there's a boundary, that a democratic society is actually a bounded endeavor. It's not infinite, it's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover every aspect of life or every aspect of our decision making. The rule of law is also seen as essential, that the processes that are laid down, specifically in constitutions and statutes and other types of procedural regulatory guides, that they are followed. And this connects with political equality because rule of law means that everybody is subject to the same rules and that the rules rule. Right? That's what rule of law means, that the rules actually rule, that we don't make decisions based on personal considerations or family relationships or deals, that the rules are the rules and the rules are followed for everybody. Now, people might be treated differently because the rules decide that they get treated differently. Somebody who steals goes to jail, and somebody who doesn't steal doesn't go to jail. But the rule that if you steal, you go to jail is followed. It's not like, well, you go to jail unless you can buy your way out of it, or unless you have family connections, or unless you make a really good emotional pitch to the person who's deciding this. No, the rules are followed, and that's what the rule of law is. Separation of powers is seen as essential, and this is connected to limited government. That if you don't separate out the different powers of government, there's the very real possibility that the government power will not be limited. It's also acknowledged that the aspects of what a democratic society system does, that self-government has multiple facets to it. There's not just a singular set of things that are done. It has multiple facets, and those different facets should be separated out into different departments, different institutions, different branches of government. Checks and balances kind of connects the separation of powers with limited government, the idea being that things should be organized so that the system itself it holds itself up and corrects itself and prevents abuses from the inside. That's what checks and balances are, is to ensure that whatever division, whatever limitations are maintained. And then finally, individual rights. And this connects with limited government, but it's an important recognition by democratic theorists that democracy is a political system that is part of a broader philosophy of individual sovereignty, that we as individual human beings have a certain set of rights and powers that belong only to us, but we live in a world where we have to have a government to settle conflicts, to protect those rights, to advance our ability to live successfully in the environment that we live in, but that there's a kind of an overarching value on individuals, and democracy itself is going to not just is going to protect those individual rights at the same time that it brings us together in a larger whole than our individual selves. And so there's a balancing here. Democratic society is a balance between the individual and society, between our right to decide for ourselves and society's right to set rules for itself. It's a balance between limited government, keeping the government from going into every corner of the world, and empowering that government through a certain separation of powers, checks and balances, representation. So there's a balancing act. Democracy is not a singular value, and it's not a sort of monolithic thing where democracy is popular sovereignty. A democratic society is it's a social machine, a social construct. Also, it has an orientation towards the individual. Now, one of the things that you can see up here on the board is they work together and conflict, and I've talked about already some of the ways in which these values work together. One of the things that's tricky about democratic theory is that the essential values don't all always play nicely with each other. Sometimes manifesting one value is going to actually undermine the other. And this is a fundamental trade-off that's built into this very complex system, and it creates certain kinds of problems and then raises questions and here are the questions. It really raises the second question, which is how to manage these conflicts. So let me go through the questions before I get back to the managing conflicts. Democratic theory is concerned with how do we manifest these values? How do we turn these things from words into action? How do we manage conflicts when two or more of these values actually run into each other on the ground, like in reality? And I'll give a few examples of this. And then how do we sustain self-government? How do we sustain all of these things working together even when they sometimes conflict? That's obviously a very difficult thing. How do you get a democratic system to keep being democratic and keep adhering to these 8 values? Now, I'll focus here on how to manage conflicts. And I won't necessarily give answers to how to manage conflicts. That's actually a big part of what we're going to be exploring in the subsequent modules, is how to manage these conflicts. I want to note some of the deepest, most problematic conflicts that exist. And I'll just start with representative government and political equality. Both of those are really important, right? Except in the very limiting case of a very small society, we're going to have representation. Some people are going to have offices that other people don't have. And those offices have powers that give certain people something that other people do not have. That right there is a form of inequality that is a political inequality, right? If you're a member of the Senate, if you're a member of the United States Senate right now, you have way, way more power than any of us who are not members of the Senate. So how can we have representative government and yet sustain political equality? That is a fundamental conflict because we have automatically, with representative government, we have a form of political inequality. Now, that doesn't mean that democracy is a self-contradictory endeavor that's destined to fail because these two important values are going to run into each other. What this sets up is a question of, okay, how do we, given that there is some kind of inequality, how do we maintain a broader equality, and how do we then mitigate the worst consequences of inequality, right? The 100 senators, and in fact, within the Senate itself, while each of those senators has a vote, there really is an unequal distribution of power. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, he has more power than even 51 senators who might want to vote for example, a $2,000 stimulus check. We could say that, let's say that 53 senators would vote yes on that. But if they never get a chance to vote yes on that because the majority leader won't put that bill in front of them for a vote, then there's political inequality there. So we have two levels of political inequality. How do we make sure that power is distributed unequally, which it has to be for a representative government, and yet it's distributed unequally in a way that doesn't fundamentally undermine our political equality? That's a very difficult question. Another conflict that is deeply embedded, one of the fundamental ones, is between popular sovereignty and individual rights. Popular sovereignty is the people making rules for themselves. Individual rights, we could also call this individual sovereignty, is individuals making rules for themselves. Obviously, popular sovereignty is a manifestation of individual sovereignty. If I'm a being that has the right to make choices for myself, and then I live in a society where choices are going to have to be made for all of us, otherwise it'll be chaotic and unproductive, then it makes sense for me to have a voice in the making of those rules. That's why popular sovereignty and individual rights play well together. That's how they complement and work with each other. But obviously, in specific, there might be, and I won't even say might be, there are always going to be decisions that the people make that individuals don't like, right? For example, I might not like a particular form of taxation. I might not like an income tax. I don't want to pay an income tax, yet the people have decided through the democratic processes that are in place, through representative government, that there's going to be an income tax. I could feel tyrannized by this act of popular sovereignty. Anything the people decides is going to be objected to by some number of individuals who don't want to do that specific thing. People are going to say, well, you can't, I don't want to wear a mask. Well, the rule is that you have to wear a mask. It's on the sign, we decided it. This is a policy outcome that resulted from a fair and democratic process. But I don't want to do it. You're telling me how to live my life. There are always going to be these points of conflict between individual rights and popular sovereignty. And that is going to be problematic. That's actually going to create that kind of chafing, that kind of sense that, like, okay, I know we have to have societally created rules so that we can all live in harmony and productively, or at least in most harmony and somewhat productively, but I chafe against some of those specific rules because that's not how I would do it if it was just up to me. Again, this gets back to that balancing, right? Democracy is going to be balancing the right of the people to rule themselves with the right of individuals to rule their own lives. And that tension is never going to go away. And the need to balance those two things is an ever-present need of a democratic society. It's actually one of the greatest pressures, too, that makes the democratic society be unhealthy, to the extent that there is a vigorous adherence to the notion of individual sovereignty, that society is made up of a bunch of people who want to make their own choices, who want to take responsibility for their own lives, who want room to make decisions for themselves. That's really necessary to a vibrant democracy, because those people will then participate heartily in a system of popular sovereignty. But when that becomes so strong that people begin to feel any exercise of popular sovereignty as an infringement upon their individual liberty, then that can decay the connection that a democratic society requires. And that is a tension that, particularly in the United States, it always is here. It's always simmering. Our strong sense of personal liberty and the desire for personal liberty, the desire not to be told by the government what to do, is one of the sort of most robust values that upholds our democratic society. But it can become powerful and pathological to the point where it makes people object to all or most of the exercises of popular sovereignty, or when they're on the losing side of things, they say, not my president, not my laws, not my rules. I didn't have a voice in creating this, or I object to it. That can then undermine the healthy functioning of a democracy. So conflicts between individual rights and popular sovereignty can't go away. This can't be sidestepped. one of the fundamental challenges of democratic theory is how to balance these two very important pieces of this system. There's obviously also problems between, say, checks and balances and popular sovereignty, or between checks and balances and representative government. If people are chosen, either elected or appointed or hired, to do a certain job and given a certain power, and that power is meant to be an expression of popular sovereignty, they're doing the will of the people, and then there are checks and balances that make it hard to do that, or that block that power from being exercised, then their popular sovereignty might be impinged, it might be undermined, right? One of the problems with a democratic society that has a vigorous set of checks and balances is that the people themselves could want things to happen, and the system is set up to make it very challenging for those things to happen, and so when they don't. So for example, Americans want a solution to the economic crisis. Americans want to suffer from climate change. Americans want to make sure that we have a good healthcare system. These are problems that Americans want to solve, right? Now, they don't necessarily want to solve them in the same way, but the vast majority of people want them addressed and solved. To the extent that we have a vigorous system of checks and balances that makes it difficult to solve certain problems, then the people aren't necessarily getting what they want. The more obstacles you create to policymaking, the more you're privileging checks and balances over popular sovereignty. And this is a built-in tension as well. This is as unavoidable as the tension between popular sovereignty and individual rights. You need checks and balances to maintain limited government. These two things really go together. They're very close cousins. You need these two things. And separation of powers, of course, is connected with this as well. But to the extent that you have a successful system of limited government, you're also undermining popular sovereignty. The question is, how do you balance those things? So these are the basic values of a democratic society. We're always going to be referencing back to one or more of these when we make pragmatic decisions about how to organize, say, a government institution or an election system. Or a set of policy-making processes. We're always going to be referencing back to one or more of these to say, well, this is why we need to have this, or this is why this is one of the options available to us. But there's always going to be another value that could potentially, not always, because they work together well, but could potentially create a conflict. And so a really important and difficult thing is going to be, how do we manage those conflicts? And that's where we're going to get a lot of disagreement. Do you lean, when there's a conflict between popular sovereignty and individual rights, do you lean in the direction of protecting individual rights, even if that undermines popular sovereignty? Or do you lean in the other direction? Do you lean in the direction of making sure society can make rules for itself, even at the expense of sometimes people don't get to make decisions for themselves? Same thing with checks and balances and popular sovereignty. Do you lean in the direction of empowering the people to make rules for themselves and to solve problems? Or do you lean in the direction of creating obstacles so that we don't end up having abuses? What kind of democracy do you want? Do you want a more empowered one, or do you want a more limited one? Do you want a societally oriented one or an individually oriented one? Those are philosophical and value differences that will lead to conflicts between people who want things to go in a different way. So democratic theory is not just an exploration of a basic set of pragmatic and value-based questions. It's also an exploration of the inherent conflicts and an attempt to reconcile those conflicts. And when you're trying to reconcile inherent conflicts, built-in conflicts, there's going to be no right answer. There's no like, oh, okay, here's exactly the right balance between individual rights and popular sovereignty. It's always going to be a question of, well, your version of the balance is different than my version of the balance. Why do you think it should be this way, and why do I think it should be this way? And ultimately, we may not be able to decide which of our versions is the better balance, because ultimately there might not be a, air quoted, a better balance, right? There isn't a right answer. And I will say that I do believe that there is no right answer to what makes a democratic system, what makes a democratic society. There are a variety of different answers, and there are things that definitely don't work, right? There are things we can say, well, that's not democratic at all. But there's no one version, there's no one set of answers. And that is going to make this endeavor, this exploration, potentially frustrating. And I just want to note up front to you that when you feel that frustration, yes, that is, you're feeling a true thing, and you're running up against something that I think is unavoidable. It doesn't mean that you can't fight through the frustration. It doesn't mean that it's a pointless endeavor to explore these questions about what does it mean for a people to govern themselves. It just means that ultimately we're never going to get the same kind of satisfaction as if we were solving an equation for x where there's a specific answer for x. So if you need x to equal some quantity, democratic theory is going to be problematic and frustrating for you, so just know that going in. Okay, well that sets up the terrain, the exploration, the concepts and sort of questions that are going to be guiding us throughout our entire exploration in this class. And so I will just sign off and say that the next set of lectures in Module 1 is going to get into the nitty-gritty of a lot of these specific questions. So if you're feeling like this has all been kind of vague, just know that the details, the specifics are coming, concreteness is on its way very soon.